This is WFYI News Now. It's July 31st, and I'm Abriana Herron. On today's show, an effort to better understand the leading cause of occupational death for firefighters, the debate around the changes to high school diplomas, and a recent Indy Star investigation focused on allegations of predatory behavior by a man who was at the center of the Mayor Hogsett circle for years.
I think it shows just how powerful Thomas Cook was in the Hogsett administration, was in his world.
Those stories coming up. But first, the IU Board of Trustees passed a new expressive activities policy that creates guidelines for when and how activities like protests can take place on campus. The policy creates a ban on camping, which outlaws the liberated zone in Dunn Meadow on the Bloomington campus. The new rule also applies to the IU Indianapolis encampment at the downtown Indianapolis campus. It prohibits expressive activity within 25 feet of the entrance to a building or parking lot and overnight. Trustee Vivian Winston voted in the minority against the policy. She tried unsuccessfully to change a passage that allows the university to immediately suspend violators from campus.
I think that they're being treated as guilty until proven innocent. And that doesn't go along with our law in the United States, where you're innocent until proven guilty.
The policy passed 6-3. It goes into effect August 1st. The leading cause of occupational death for firefighters is cancer. As WFYI's Samantha Horton reports, a new state testing program aims to improve the understanding between PFAS and cancer rates amongst firefighters.
One source that has been linked to exposure for firefighters is PFAS, also known as forever chemicals, found in fire protection gear and equipment. Through the new Indiana Firefighter PFAS biomonitoring pilot program, participants will receive a test kit in the mail to collect a drop of blood for lab tests to be run. Professional Firefighters Union of Indiana President Tony Murray says the program will help the state learn more about occupational risk.
It's really important, I think, for us to be able to take this first step to understand the risk from exposure based on what we will find and learn from the level of PFAS in firefighters' blood.
Murray says work continues to identify industry-approved alternative gear made without PFAS and increase access to early detection screenings. I'm Samantha Horton.
The deadline to sign up for the pilot testing program is August 9th. What a high school experience could look like for the class of 2029 is under debate. Some Democratic lawmakers have begun to seek out their own voices on changes to high school diplomas. Representative Victoria Garcia-Wilburn heard repeated worries from parents and community members in her Hamilton County district. She decided to host events focused on the shift.
There is no peer state that has done such a radical change in diploma offerings that we know of. And so we'd really be piloting this.
Garcia-Wilburn says if these proposed changes were to go into effect, many students would never see a day in her own classroom at Indiana University. She's an assistant professor at the university's occupational therapy program.
This really worries me that I maybe won't have any future Hoosier students.
The Education Department plans to share a revised draft of the diplomas to the state board in August. The feedback period for the Education Department's first draft of new diplomas concluded Tuesday after a public hearing at the Indiana Government Center South. And for our final story today, Thomas Cook, a former Indianapolis chief of staff in the Hogsett administration, was the focus of allegations of sexual harassment and predatory behavior from 3 women. That's according to an investigation by the Indianapolis Star. Reporters Haley Colombo and James Briggs talked to WFYI's Jill Sheridan about their investigation into the allegations.
James, could you talk a little bit about, what triggered this investigation and why you two decided to follow this story?
We've seen on social media in the days since it published that there has been sort of speculation and rumors about this behavior for some time, but that's all it really is until women who have experienced behavior from someone in power feel comfortable coming out and sharing it. And that's really what happened in this case. The alleged behavior occurred as far back as 2014 and as recently as last year, but we just had on-the-record sources very recently, and that enabled us to tell this story. So 3 women, one of whom agreed to be named, alleged to us a pattern of behavior. They say that he sexually harassed them. In one case, a woman says that Cook assaulted her. The pattern described to us is this: complimenting younger women on staff, often much younger, early 20s. Cook is 39 now. He'd show them sort of a vision of their future. You'll be running this place someday. What kind of job you want, just tell me. 3 women told us that he pressured them toward intimacy, relationships, towards sexual encounters. And Mayor Joe Hogsett knew about at least some of these allegations going back to 2017.
What do you think this tells us about the power structure of the Hogsett administration and that people are able to operate in this way?
I think it shows just how powerful Thomas Cook was in the Hogsett administration, was in his world for this entire time. I mean, people know the mayor, right? People know that, the mayor is in charge of the city, but they don't ever see this person in the background who really is, from day-to-day decision-making to strategic decision-making, really making this person's administration. So I think it just underlines to me his importance within local democratic politics.
I think one of the things our story points out, too, is to a large extent the chief of staff runs the city. You can argue at times, certainly, the chief of staff has more oversight over day-to-day management of the city than the mayor does. And that became one of the problems that we talk about in the story, because the women who experienced his behavior felt like they had no avenue to report it, because even though ostensibly HR has a pathway directly to the mayor, the way it actually worked, as described to us, is that the chief of staff oversaw absolutely everything from a practical standpoint. So if somebody felt comfortable enough to report the behavior, they would have reported it to a supervisor who was ultimately answerable to Thomas Cook, or they would have reported it to HR, which ultimately would have been answerable to Thomas Cook. And so they felt there was really nowhere to go with this.
What do we know about how he was hired back after being, formally disciplined?
The city now says that it reprimanded and disciplined Thomas Cook 3 times over the course of the years. There was one investigation in 2020 which found that Cook had engaged in an inappropriate relationship with a subordinate employee. In that case, that is a woman who is not accusing Cook of harassment, but the city found nonetheless that it violated city policy, which prohibits people in powerful positions, supervisory positions, from having relationships with people who work under them. So as a result of that, the city says that he was forced to resign, although the timing on that is not clear because the investigation happened earlier in the year, and Cook seems to have left under his own circumstances at the end of the year in December 2020. So it's not exactly clear how that timeline works out. But then, so the city says now that he was forced to resign in 2020 over an investigation. But then in 2023, Mayor Hogsett brought Cook back to lead his latest reelection campaign.
So, the women in your story calling for a better reporting process. What might that look like for future administrations in a city like Indianapolis?
I think that is a question that the Hogsett administration or administrations that come after him will have to answer, because, it's clear from our reporting that there's a fundamental flaw of someone, not being able to report harassment to a neutral party, right? Ultimately, I'm sure other cities, other municipalities have figured this out, but I think it calls into question reporting structures across all levels of government. What happens when the person who's in charge, ultimately answerable to these sorts of allegations, is the person who is allegedly committing sexual harassment?
Well, I thank you both so much for coming in to talk today about your important reporting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all for today's episode of WFYI News Now. Our podcast is produced by Drew Daudelin with support from the news team at WFYI and public media journalists across the state. Our news director is Sarah Neal-Estes. Kendall Antron produced our music, and I'm your host, Abriana Herron. If you like today's episode, remember to subscribe and share, and follow WFYI on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube to check in on our newsroom throughout the day. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.